In a luxurious restaurant, a millionaire decided to transform a simple business meeting into a cruel spectacle of humiliation. Before foreign investors, he offered $1,000 to a humble employee just to ridicule her in a language he believed she would never speak. What he did not imagine was that that silent woman carried a secret capable of completely changing the fate of that $1 million negotiation. And when she finally opened her mouth and spoke in Japanese, the entire restaurant fell into absolute silence. Before discovering what happened next and how this story ended, subscribe to the channel and prepare to hear one of the most impressive twists you have ever seen. The restaurant Imperador, in the heart of the Jardins neighborhood in São Paulo, was the type of place where every detail had been calculated to impress. The walls lined with Italian marble reflected the golden light of the crystal chandeliers, and the waiters moved between the tables with the silent precision of those who had been trained to become invisible. It was a place built on the premise that money conferred elegance, and that elegance, in turn, bought respect. On that Thursday in November, the restaurant had been reserved for a meeting that could, according to rumors circulating among the employees, move more money than any of them would see in their entire lives. The group of Japanese investors, led by the discreet Kenji Watanabe, had arrived in Brazil to close a premium seafood export contract. On the Brazilian side, the businessman Renato Cavalcanti, owner of Cavalcanti Alimentos S.A., awaited at the head of the long table like a king awaiting vassals. Renato was 62 years old, but he carried the arrogance of someone who had never needed to ask for anything with kindness. He had built his fortune with shortcuts that rarely appeared in annual reports, and his imported suit cost more than the monthly salary of all the downstairs employees combined. His gray hair was impeccably combed, and his dark eyes swept the hall with the impatience of someone who always expected the world to adjust to his pace. The problem that night was that the translator hired to mediate the meeting simply had not appeared. Renato had already tried to call 3 times. No answer. His 2 partners, Fabio Monteiro and Cesar Drummond, exchanged nervous glances while the Japanese talked among themselves with a politeness that seemed at that moment almost like a silent judgment. On the other side of the hall, far from the tables covered in white tablecloths and the fresh flower arrangements, there was a service corridor that separated the visible world of the restaurant from the world that sustained it. It was there that Vera Almeida worked. Vera was 43 years old, and 6 months ago she had been hired to clean the restaurant during the afternoon and night shifts. She wore a navy blue uniform with the discreet logo of the outsourced company, and carried a sanitization cart with wheels that squeaked slightly when she pulled it through the service corridors. Her hands, with short nails and no polish, had the marks of someone who worked with chemical products every day. Redness on the knuckles, roughness on the palm. No one in the restaurant knew much about her. She was punctual, discreet, efficient. She never complained about overtime, never asked for favors. The shift manager, Donna Graça, used to say that Vera was the type who didn't cause trouble, and in the vocabulary of the Imperador, that was the greatest compliment possible. Vera had arrived in Brazil coming from a story she preferred not to tell. Before São Paulo, she had lived in Osaka for almost 15 years. Before Osaka, she had studied in Kyoto, and before that, she had grown up in a simple family of fishermen in the interior of Ceará, where her mother had taught her that learning was the only inheritance that no one could steal. Vera had taken this teaching seriously, in a way that her mother had never imagined possible. But all this belonged to another chapter of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. That night, Vera was picking up the shards of a glass that had slipped from the hands of a distracted waiter near the entrance of the main hall. She bent down carefully, used the plastic dustpan and swept with attention so as not to leave any fragment on the polished granite floor. It was a job that required concentration. The shards could be treacherous. It was at that moment that Renato Cavalcanti looked in her direction. He was speaking loudly with Fabio, gesturing with ill-disguised irritation, when his eyes met the figure of Vera crouched on the floor. There was something in his expression, at that instant, that changed. It was not compassion. It was the recognition of an opportunity, the kind that people like Renato identified with the speed of predators spotting vulnerable prey. Kenji Watanabe, sitting to his left, had stood up discreetly to check the time on his cell phone. Renato needed to do something to regain control of the situation, to demonstrate that he was still the one in command of that room. And then, with a snap of fingers that echoed through the entire hall, he called Vera. The sound was dry, authoritative, the type of gesture that dispensed with any words because it presumed immediate obedience. Vera raised her eyes. For a second, just a second, her face revealed absolutely nothing. Then she took the cart by the handle, left the collected shards inside the bucket, and began to walk toward the table. The other waiters looked at the floor. Renato's partners exchanged a smile of complicity. Two customers at nearby tables interrupted their conversations without realizing it, attracted by something they still could not name, but that they recognized instinctively as tension. Kenji Watanabe sat back down and observed the scene with a neutral, impenetrable expression. Vera stopped 3 steps from the table. Renato examined her from head to toe with a deliberate slowness, projecting his gaze like an instrument of power. Then he smiled, that wide, condescending smile of someone who is about to have fun. "Do you know what Japanese is?" he asked loudly, clearly intending the question for the hall as much as for her. "It is a language, a very difficult language, impossible for simple people." Vera did not answer. She stood still, with her hands crossed in front of her apron, and waited. "I'll give you $1,000, he said, raising his voice and lifting the wad of bills he took from his suit pocket, "if you serve me in Japanese. Now. Here, in front of everyone." Fabio let out a low laugh. Cesar spun his wineglass between his fingers with a smile on his lips. Some customers at neighboring tables were now looking without disguise. A young waitress, standing near the counter, bit her lower lip with discomfort. The bills fluttered in Renato's outstretched hand like a flag of humiliation. Vera looked at the money, and for a long moment, a moment that seemed to last much longer than the seconds it actually did, she simply stayed quiet, as if she were having an internal conversation that no one around was allowed to hear. Vera's silence lasted the exact time necessary for Renato to begin to feel too comfortable. It was this type of pause that he interpreted as defeat, the hesitation of someone who had no answer, who was looking for a way out, who had been cornered in front of everyone and knew it. He was so convinced of his reading of the situation that he didn't even notice the moment when everything began to change. Renato turned to Kenji with a smile and said, in Portuguese with the casualness of someone speaking in a code that the interlocutor does not master, "Look at this. I brought a distraction for you. Simple people trying to understand high-class things." Fabio snorted with laughter. Cesar took a puff from the electronic cigarette he held discreetly below the table. What none of the three expected was what would come next. Vera took a deep breath. Not with dramaturgy, not like someone preparing for a speech. She breathed like someone who organizes their own thoughts before acting with precision. Then she turned completely away from Renato, took 3 steps toward the opposite head of the table, and bowed her body in a slow, elegant, and deeply respectful bow toward Kenji Watanabe and his 2 companions. And then she spoke. The Japanese that came out of her mouth was clean, fluid, and loaded with a formal politeness that is only acquired with years of immersion. She apologized for the inadequate conduct of the meeting, explained that she deeply regretted that they had witnessed that moment, and guaranteed that the discomfort caused did not reflect the hospitality they deserved to receive. The entire hall stopped. It was not a gradual pause. It was the kind of silence that falls all at once, like a cloth. Waiters immobilized, customers with forks in the air. The young waitress near the counter let out a low, almost imperceptible sound of contained surprise. Kenji Watanabe looked at Vera for a few seconds without blinking. Then, with a calm and grave voice, he responded in Japanese. He asked if she could help them better understand what had been proposed in that meeting, since the hired mediator had not appeared. Vera replied that yes, with pleasure, if the restaurant management and the parties involved agreed. Renato was standing without having realized he had stood up. His face had gone through a rapid cycle of expressions, incredulity, irritation, recalculation, and had fixed into a mask of forced composure that fooled no one. He pulled the chair back with more force than he intended and sat down, crossing his arms. "This is an interesting coincidence," he said, in a tone that tried to be casual and sounded only tense. Vera did not answer him. She turned back to Kenji and, with the serenity of someone who is not performing an extraordinary feat but simply doing what needs to be done, began to present the menu in Japanese. She described each dish with culinary precision, mentioned the regional ingredients, explained the combinations suggested by the chef. The three investors listened with increasing attention, and the youngest of them, Hiroshi, asked a question about the fish served in the main starter. Vera answered in detail. Then, almost naturally, she added a personal recommendation. The fresh grouper on that night's menu had arrived directly from the coast of Espirito Santo that same day, and she suggested it as the main course. Hiroshi smiled slightly. Kenji made a discreet note in the small notebook he always kept open on the table. Fabio Montero leaned toward Renato and whispered, "Where did this woman come from?" Renato did not answer. He was observing Vera with an expression that had evolved from irritation to something harder to name, a mixture of fascination and discomfort, like someone watching something that defies the categories with which they organize the world. Outside, the São Paulo night continued its usual noise, horns, distant sirens, the constant murmur of a city that never completely lowered its volume. But inside the Restaurant Imperador, at that moment, the only sound that mattered was the quiet voice of a woman in a navy blue uniform who had just redefined who controlled the room. Vera moved between languages with a naturalness that was disconcerting. When she needed to communicate something to a waiter, she spoke Portuguese. When she addressed the investors, she returned to Japanese without any hesitation or visible transition. It was like watching someone who thinks in two languages simultaneously and does not need to translate. They just choose which voice to use depending on who is listening. Renato, for his part, was beginning to understand that he had lost something in that transition. He didn't know exactly what. He didn't know yet how much. Then Kenji leaned slightly in his chair and said something directly to Vera. She listened carefully, nodded once, and then turned to the table with a serene expression. "Mr. Watanabe would like to know," she said in Portuguese, addressing the table but without looking specifically at any of the three partners, if the contract being proposed contemplates only the kinmedai variety in the original specification, or if there is room for species substitution according to stock availability. The question fell on the table like a stone on a glass surface. Cesar almost dropped his glass. Fabio blinked twice in a row. Renato stayed absolutely still for a whole second, and in that second, something passed through the expression on his face that was not irritation or arrogance, but something much closer to the recognition of a danger that had arrived too early. Because that specific question, about that specific clause, was not in any material distributed that night. It was not on the menu. It was not in the formal presentation that Fabio had delivered at the beginning of the meeting. It was only in the conversation the three had had in Portuguese a few minutes before, believing that no one besides them could understand it. Renato Cavalcanti took exactly 3 seconds to regain his composure. He was a man who had survived many difficult situations throughout decades of business, meetings that went off the rails, partners who changed sides, contracts that crumbled at the wrong time. He knew how to redirect a narrative. He knew how to turn an uncomfortable question into background noise. "That is a mistaken interpretation," he said, with that grave and deliberate voice he used when he wanted to seem reasonable. "The contract is industry standard. There is no irregularity." Vera did not push back. She just turned to Kenji and translated the answer with the same neutrality with which she had translated everything else. Kenji listened, paused, and then said something brief. Vera translated back. Mr. Watanabe thanked him for the clarification and would like to examine the document carefully before any signature. It was a polite move. It was also, in that context, a declaration of distrust. Renato reached for the contract that was on the table, but Hiroshi, the youngest of the investors, had placed his own hand over it discreetly, in a gesture that was not aggressive, but was absolutely clear. Renato withdrew his arm slowly. Fabio Montero stood up with the excuse of going to the bathroom and passed near Vera with long strides, brushing her shoulder in a gesture that was intended to be intimidation disguised as an accident. Vera did not waver. She continued standing, hands crossed in front, eyes on the table. The shift manager, Donna Grassa, had appeared discreetly at the entrance of the hall. She observed the scene with the expression of someone who does not know what they are seeing, but knows they are seeing something They should not be seeing. She considered intervening. She decided not to. Kenji Watanabe opened the contract to the marked page and read in silence for a few minutes. Then he pointed to a specific clause and said something to Vera. Vera looked at the indicated passage. It was paragraph 17, subsection C, written in technical language dense enough to be ignored in a first reading, but clear enough for someone who knew what to look for, to reveal exactly what it hid. The clause allowed, under certain conditions of stock unavailability, the replacement of kinmedai, a noble fish of high commercial value, with equivalent species defined unilaterally by the supplier. For equivalent, in Renato Cavalcanti's contract vocabulary, meant whatever he wanted it to mean. Vera read the passage once, then she read it again, and then, with a calmness that was almost disconcerting, she began to translate the content of the clause into Japanese word for word, without omitting anything and without adding anything. Kenji Watanabe's face did not change as he listened. It was the type of expression one learns to cultivate in years of international negotiations, a polished surface that does not reveal what happens underneath. But his two companions did not have the same training. Hiroshi closed his eyes for a second. The other, whose name Vera had not yet learned, let his jaw go tense in a way that was visible enough for any attentive observer to notice. "She is explaining the contract," said Renato, with a tone that tried to be neutral and was not. "That is what she was hired to do." "She was not hired to do that," said Cesar in a low voice, leaning toward Renato. "She cleans bathrooms." "She cleans the hall," corrected Renato, as if the distinction mattered at all at that moment. Kenji then took a card from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to Vera with both hands, in a gesture of formal respect. He said a few more words. Vera listened, and this time a slight flush crossed her face, the first visible sign of emotion she had shown all night. Kenji raised his eyes from the contract and said something directly to Vera. The question was brief, formulated with precision. Vera answered, also briefly, and then turned to the table. "Mr. Watanabe asks if, according to the conversation held previously at this table, the supplier's intention was to use this clause to justify the delivery of a product of inferior quality to what was verbally agreed." The silence that settled was different from the previous ones. It was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of recognition. Everyone in the room, from the immobile waiters to the customers who were no longer even pretending to eat, understood that a moment of no return had arrived. Renato stood up. This time it was not an involuntary movement. It was a choice. The choice of someone who decides to change strategy when the current one no longer works. "I don't know what this employee said to you," he declared, projecting his voice with authority, "but she is clearly overstepping her duties and interpreting documents she has no competence to analyze. I demand that she leave immediately." Vera did not move. Kenji Watanabe looked at Renato for a long moment. Then he looked at Vera. And then he said in Japanese something she translated with the same quiet voice as always. "Mr. Watanabe says he greatly appreciates Mr. Cavalcanti's willingness to clarify the terms of the contract and would like to grant him the opportunity to confirm publicly that clause 17 subsection C will not be used for species substitution under any circumstances." It was an invitation. It was also an elegant trap. Because if Renato confirmed, he would be giving up the only mechanism that made the deal profitable in the way he had planned. And if he refused to confirm, or if he hesitated, the answer would itself be a confirmation of what Vera had implied. Renato Cavalcanti opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and in that interval, Fabio Montero returned from the bathroom, quickly read the expression of everyone at the table, and stood still at the entrance of the hall like someone who realizes they have arrived too late to change anything. Renato chose the option that men like him usually choose when pressured. He attacked. Not physically, not yet, but with the only weapon he had left at that moment, which was humiliation. If he could not control what Vera knew, he could at least try to destroy the credibility of the one who knew it. "I don't know who paid this woman to come here to sabotage my meeting," he said, with a voice that had discarded any pretense of reasonableness. "But this is a farce. a cleaning employee who supposedly speaks fluent Japanese, who by chance was present exactly when we needed a translator, who by chance knows the technical details of the contract. He opened his arms in a wide gesture, looking at the room as if asking the audience to confirm the absurdity. This doesn't happen. This was a setup. Kenji Watanabe heard the translation Vera made in a low voice. He responded with a few words. Mr. Watanabe says, translated Vera, that setups usually require planning, and that cleaning people are rarely hired to plan setups. Some customers could not contain their laughter. It was brief, muffled, but it was real, and Renato heard it. Donna Graça had cautiously approached the hall, worried about the increasing volume of the discussion. The shift maitre d', a middle-aged man named Rodrigo, was beside her with the expression of someone who wished the floor would swallow him. "Vera," said Donna Graça with a voice that tried to be firm but came out only insecure, "maybe you should—" "She is not going anywhere," said Kenji Watanabe in Portuguese. The sentence fell in the hall like a stone. It was the first time he had spoken in the language since the beginning of the night, and the precision with which he did it, without an exaggerated accent, with a completely functional intonation, made it clear that his choice not to speak Portuguese until that moment had been a deliberate decision, not a limitation. Renato stayed with his mouth open for a second. "I understand Portuguese reasonably well," said Kenji with almost didactic calmness. "I always learn the basics of the country's language before doing business. It is a matter of respect," he paused, "and precaution." The meaning of the sentence expanded in the air like ink in water. Cesar Drummond placed his wineglass on the table with excessive care, like someone who suddenly realizes that the ground under their feet is more fragile than they thought. Fabio Monteiro, still standing at the entrance, involuntarily retreated half a step. "The conversation you gentlemen held in Portuguese," said Kenji, now looking directly at Renato, "was clear enough. I did not need translation for the essentials." Renato stood up again, this time with a different energy. It was no longer the calculated posture of the negotiator. It was the poorly controlled impulse of someone who sees a situation escape completely from their hands and no longer knows what to do other than react. He took 2 steps toward Vera and pointed his finger at her with an intensity that made the young waitress near the counter instinctively step back. "You will regret this," he said, in a low voice, but not low enough. It was Hiroshi who moved first. The youngest of the investors stood up with surprising speed and stood between Renato and Vera, not with aggressiveness, but with the firmness of someone who establishes a physical limit in an unequivocal way. The 2 men stared at each other for a moment. Renato backed down. Not because he had chosen to back down, but because there was something in Hiroshi's posture, in that space he had created with his own body, that made any advance impossible without an escalation that even Renato recognized he could not afford to make. Vera had not moved during all that. She had stayed exactly where she was with her hands crossed, observing everything with that expression difficult to classify. It was not coldness, it was not fear, it was not triumph. It was something more like concentration, like someone who is in the middle of a process that has not yet finished and knows it. Kenji stood up from the chair slowly, with the ceremonial deliberation of someone closing a stage. He took the contract on the table, flipped to paragraph 17, and then, with a clean gesture and without drama, tore the sheets in half. The sound of the torn paper was the loudest sound in the hall at that moment. "We are finished here," said Kenji in Portuguese, looking at Renato. "We wish you a good night." Renato stayed immobile. His face had passed to a shade his partners had rarely seen, not red with anger, but whitish, almost pale, like someone who is still calculating the extent of what they just lost. The contract he had spent months building, the millions he already considered guaranteed, the operation he had planned in the smallest details, all of that had been dismantled in less than an hour by a woman in a navy blue uniform whom he had called with a snap of his fingers. And then, as if he needed a last valve for the accumulated pressure, he turned to Vera. He took the wad of bills from his pocket, the same bills he had brandished at the beginning of the night as an instrument of humiliation, and extended them toward her again. "Take it," he said, with a voice that intended to be despicable, but came out only tired. "You won. Take the money and vanish." Vera looked at the bills. Vera refused the money with a simple gesture. She slightly lowered her chin and turned her face, the type of movement that did not need words to be understood. Renato was left with the bills suspended in the air for an awkward second. Then he stuffed them back into his pocket with a brusqueness that revealed more than he intended. Kenji said something to Hiroshi in Japanese. The youngest of the investors nodded and went to the table to get the leather case he had brought with him. The three prepared to depart with the efficiency of those who have another place to be, as if that restaurant which had been the stage for all that had already become the past. But before walking toward the exit, Kenji stopped before Vera and spoke in Japanese. She listened carefully. Then she translated to herself in silence, processing not the language but the meaning of it. "He said that people with this level of honesty and competence are hard to find," she murmured, almost to herself, in Portuguese. Dona Graça, who had approached closer and was now a few meters away, heard. She was left with an expression that mixed pride and confusion in equal parts. Kenji then took a card from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to Vera with both hands, in a gesture of formal respect. He said a few more words. Vera listened, and this time a slight flush crossed her face, the first visible sign of emotion she had shown all night. "He is offering a position in their international logistics company," she said, translating without being asked, perhaps because the information was too big to stay only inside her, "as a consultant for bilateral relations with Brazil." The young waitress near the counter put her hand to her mouth. Rodrigo, the maitre d', let out an almost inaudible, "My God." Cesar Drummond was looking at the floor. Fabio was still standing at the entrance of the hall, with the expression of a man who realized too early what had happened and too late to change anything. Vera held the card with care, like someone holding something fragile. Then she looked at Renato. Renato was at the head of the empty table, without a contract, without partners, without the triumphant noise that had filled that place hours before. There was something almost pathetic in that image, not in the sense that it deserved compassion, but in the sense that it revealed what was underneath the arrogance when it was removed. There was no substance. There was only the void that the arrogance had filled for so long. "You could have sent me away," said Vera, with a quiet voice that had neither anger nor revenge. "From the beginning, that was what I expected." Renato did not answer. "But you preferred the spectacle," she continued, "and every spectacle has an audience." She turned to the room. The customers who were still present looked at her with the silent attention of those watching something they did not expect to see. The employees, waiters, the waitress, Rodrigo, Dona Graça, were immobile, like in a painting. Vera walked to the cleaning cart she had left near the service door when she was called. She removed her apron with calm movements, folded it with attention, a clean, symmetrical, careful fold, and walked back to the table where the pieces of the torn contract were still scattered. She placed the folded apron beside them on the white tablecloth. She stood looking at the apron for a moment. There were 6 months of work in that uniform, 6 months of silent corridors, of strong-smelling products, of hands that turned red at the end of each shift. There was also the salary that barely covered the rent of the room she shared in a boarding house in Ipiranga, and the nights she stayed awake doing math that never added up. But there was something more. There was the decision made months ago that it would be that job and not another. A decision that the people around her did not understand and that she had never explained, because some choices belong only to those who make them. At that moment, however, it was time for a different choice. "I am resigning," said Vera, with a clear voice, looking at Dona Graça. The manager opened her mouth, closed it, and then said only, "Vera." "Thank you for the work," said Vera. "You were always fair to me." Dona Graça nodded with damp eyes in a way she clearly was not expecting and did not know how to hide. Vera took her bag, which was stored in the service corridor locker, slung the strap over her shoulder, and returned to the hall. She walked through the central passage between the tables, with her head held high and the regular step of someone who is not in a hurry, but also has no hesitation. Kenji Watanabe and his companions, who were still near the exit, stopped and bowed in a collective gesture of respect as she passed. It was then that the applause began. It was not planned, it was not coordinated. It began with a couple at the window table, she clapping her hands hard, he a few seconds later. Then the young waitress, then Rodrigo, who had squared his shoulders like someone making a decision, then two waiters, then the other customers one by one until the entire hall was applauding. Renato Cavalcanti remained seated, alone at the head of the long table, holding the bills he had taken from his pocket one last time without wanting to, and which now only existed in his hands as a meaningless object, as proof of something that had gone completely wrong. Vera reached the revolving door of the restaurant. She pushed it, and went out into the São Paulo night with Kenji Watanabe's card in her pocket and the folded apron left behind, like someone closing a chapter, not because they were forced to, but because they decided it was time. The days that followed were strange for the Restaurant Imperador. Not because of Vera's absence. After all, she was just a cleaning employee and there were others. The strange thing was what had remained after her, a kind of silent residue, like the smell of rain that persists in the air long after the storm has passed. The waiters talked less during shifts. The young waitress, whose name was Patricia, had arrived the next morning with red eyes, and no one asked why, but everyone understood. Rodrigo, the maitre d', had written an email to the restaurant management, informing them of the occurrence in carefully neutral terms. But he had included, in the last paragraph, a sentence that was not exactly neutral. He recommended that any employee who demonstrated the qualities demonstrated by Vera Almeida receive treatment compatible with those qualities. Donna Graça had read the email 3 times before forwarding it. Renato Cavalcanti, for his part, had spent the week trying to contain the damage. The contract with the Japanese was dead, that was a fact. But there were other concerns. Cesar had heard, at a parallel dinner 2 days later, that Kenji Watanabe had sought a direct competitor of Cavalcanti Alimentos. And Fabio had found in a quick search that one of the customers present that night at the Imperador was a business columnist who wrote for a specialized publication. The columnist had not published anything yet, but had asked for an interview for general comments on the seafood export sector. Renato refused the interview. But what occupied his mind the most, and this was something he would never admit out loud, was the question that had begun to arise in moments of silence, in that zone of stillness that exists between the noise of a busy life. The question was not about the lost contract, nor about the Japanese, nor even about the money. It was a much simpler and much more uncomfortable question. Who was Vera Almeida? He had hired an information verification service, the type of company that consultants used for due diligence, but that Renato used for other purposes, and asked them to look up her history. What came back was surprisingly dense for a cleaning employee. Vera Almeida, 43 years old, born in Quixeramobim, Ceará, daughter of fishermen. She had received a scholarship at 18 through a Brazilian-Japanese cultural program and spent 4 years in Kyoto studying applied linguistics. After that, a master's degree in intercultural communication in Osaka. Almost 15 years in Japan, working in foreign trade consulting for a medium-sized company. Returned to Brazil 2.5 years ago. After the return, no record of formal work in any company in the sector in which she had worked. Only the outsourced cleaning link. There was a gap in the record, a period of a little over a year, between the return to Brazil and the start of work at the restaurant, about which the report had found nothing. It was a strange gap, the type that is not an absence of information, but a deliberate absence of traces. Renato stayed with this report on the screen for a long time, without knowing exactly what to do with it. There was a part of him that wanted to use the information as a weapon, to find in that story some vulnerability, some pressure point. It was the automatic reflex of a life built on the idea that information was power. But there was something in what he had seen that night that made it difficult to turn Vera into a simple adversary. She had not acted out of revenge. She had not humiliated Renato the way he had humiliated her, with spectacle, with visible cruelty. She had simply done what needed to be done, with the precision of someone who knows the difference between power and authority and knows that the latter does not need an audience to exist. That was harder to fight than anger. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Vera was sitting at a table in a simple cafe in Ipiranga, with Kenji Watanabe's card in front of her and her phone in hand. She had spent 3 days thinking before calling, not because she had doubts about the job. The job was, without exaggeration, the kind of opportunity she had left behind 2.5 years earlier, when she had returned to Brazil convinced that she needed to start over in a different way. The doubt was something else. There was a reason she had chosen an invisible job, a reason she had stayed away from the corridors of international trade, from the meeting rooms with a view of the city, from the contracts in Japanese and Portuguese and English. A reason that had a name, not her name, but a name she had tried to keep out of her story for 2.5 years. But sometimes life does not ask permission to start over. Vera typed the number into the phone and looked at it for a few more seconds. Then she pressed call. The conversation with Kenji Watanabe lasted 40 minutes. Vera had prepared for a formal dialogue, a 60-year-old businessman with the measured voice of someone who conducts meetings. What she found was something different. A man who spoke with the cadence of someone who is genuinely curious, who asked questions about her background not to evaluate, but to understand, and who, in the 10th minute of the conversation, said something she had not expected. "I knew who you were before arriving in Brazil." Vera was silent for a moment. "You were a consultant at Tanaka and Miyoshi before leaving," said Kenji. "I worked with Miyoshi many years ago. He told me about you when he learned we were going to Brazil." Vera closed her eyes briefly. The name of the company had surfaced like a stone thrown into a quiet lake, and the ripples it created reached places she had tried to keep calm. "Why didn't you say anything that night?" she asked. "Because it was not my place to say," answered Kenji. "You were there as you chose to be. It was your story to tell, not mine." There was something in that answer that Vera took a few seconds to process. Then she said, with a voice slightly different from the one she had used in the previous 40 minutes, "I left Tanaka for reasons I haven't finished resolving yet." "I know," said Kenji. "Miyoshi told me." "Miyoshi knows more than he should." "Miyoshi respects you very much," said Kenji, "so much that he didn't tell everything." What had happened at Tanaka 2.5 years ago was a story that Vera had kept with the care of someone who knows that some wounds get larger when exposed to the air. She had discovered at 38 years old in Japan, after 15 years building a solid reputation as a foreign trade consultant, that the partner responsible for the company's South American division had for years closed deals using data she had produced, market reports, supplier analyses, logistics route mappings, without crediting her name and without sharing the corresponding bonuses. It was not something with a formal name in the law. It was the type of injustice that happens in silence, that leaves deep marks exactly because it is the sum of dozens of small choices made by someone who knew they could do it because the structures around them allowed it. Vera had confronted the partner. Then she had taken the case to the management. Then she had realized that the management knew, had always known, and had calculated that the most convenient solution was to wait for her to get tired. She had not gotten tired. She had left. But leaving meant leaving behind 15 years of relationships, of accumulated knowledge, of a professional identity she had built with genuine work. And when she arrived in Brazil, carrying suitcases and invisible baggage that weighed more than everything, she had made a decision that seemed irrational to everyone who knew her, to disappear for a while, not literally, but professionally, to stay below the radar, to work with her hands, to give her own pride the time necessary to discover where reconstruction ended and where it began. The work at the restaurant Imperador had been the lowest point, and, strangely, the most honest of that period. In that blue uniform, she had learned that what a person knows does not disappear because it is not recognized, that competence does not ask for validation to exist, that dignity is not a concession from those who have power. It is a decision of those who know who they are. All this had become crystal clear that night, before Renato Cavalcanti and his outstretched bills. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked Kenji. "An initial 6-month consultancy," he said. "Evaluation of Brazilian partners for expansion of the supply network, with the possibility of a permanent position if there is mutual interest." "Salary?" He said a number. Vera was silent for a few seconds, not out of hesitation but out of adjustment. It was more than double what she had received at Tanaka in recent years, added to what the partner had appropriated without naming her. "I need one condition," she said. "Say it." "My work is signed with my name in reports, in presentations, in contracts. Everything I produce carries my name." There was a brief pause on the other side of the line. "Of course," said Kenji, with a naturalness that indicated the condition had not seemed excessive, only necessary, the kind of necessity that those who hear it understand without it needing to be explained. Vera stood looking at the card on the table for a moment after ending the call. There was something that still needed to be resolved, not professionally. That was, in a surprising way, beginning to reorganize itself with a clarity she had not expected. But there was a conversation she knew would need to happen, and that she had been postponing since she walked out the revolving door of the restaurant Imperador. There was a person who needed to understand what had happened that night. Not the facts anyone could narrate, but the why. And that why was a story Vera had never told anyone in Brazil, because she had never found someone who seemed ready to hear it with the honesty it deserved. She picked up the phone again, this time not to call Kenji, to call Dona Graça. Dona Graça arrived at the Ipiranga Café 15 minutes early and sat near the window, holding a cup of coffee she forgot to drink, while observing the street with the expression of someone rehearsing a conversation they don't know how to start. When Vera entered, the two looked at each other for a second before any words. There was something in that look, the recognition of two women who had existed in the same room for months without one knowing anything for real about the other. "I came because you asked," said Dona Graça when Vera sat down, "and also because I wanted to." Vera ordered a coffee. She was silent for a moment, then said, "You have the right to know who I really am. I worked for you for 6 months." Dona Graça nodded, without hurry. What Vera told lasted more than an hour. It was not a confession. It was closer to a reconstruction, an attempt to give a comprehensible form to a trajectory that she herself had taken time to understand. Kixaramobim, the scholarship, Kyoto, Osaka, the 15 years of silent construction, the confrontation at Tanaka, the return to Brazil like a stone that had been thrown in a long arc and landed in a place that was not where it had started, and the work at the Imperador, the deliberate decision, not an accident, the choice to start with the simplest thing, because she needed to remember that she knew how to start. Dona Graça heard everything without interrupting. When Vera finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I always knew you had a different story than what I imagined." "Why did you never ask?" "Because you didn't want to be asked," said Dona Graça. "And because where I grew up I learned that a person's work speaks before their name." Vera looked at her with an expression that was difficult to classify. Gratitude without sentimentalism, the kind of recognition that does not need words but chooses to use them anyway. "Will the restaurant hire someone else for my post?" asked Vera. "It already has," said Dona Graça. "A girl from the Northeast, young, hard-working." She paused. "I made sure to ensure she was well received." There was something in that sentence that sounded like a direct consequence of what had happened that night, as if Vera's passage through the Imperador had left a mark not on the walls or in the documents, but in the choices of the people who stayed. Before saying goodbye, Dona Graça took a small envelope from her pocket and placed it on the table. "This is from the employees," she said. "Patricia, Rodrigo, the waiters. Each one put in what they could. It is not much." Vera opened the envelope. There were a few folded bills and a handwritten note in small handwriting that said only, "You taught us something. Thank you." Vera stood looking at the note for a time that was longer than she had planned. When she raised her eyes, Dona Graça had the expression of someone who understands when it is time to leave the other with a moment of their own. "Go well, Vera," she said, standing up. "Go very well." 2 days later, Vera entered for the first time the temporary office that Kenji's team had rented in a commercial building on Faria Lima. It was a simple, functional space, with wide windows overlooking São Paulo's financial axis, that forest of glass and concrete that had been built on the idea that ambition justified almost everything. Hiroshi received her at the reception with a respectful bow of the head. There was a new desk waiting for her with a computer, a notepad, and a business card still in its packaging, the first with her name, her position, and the logo of Kenji's company. Vera opened the card with care. She read her own name printed there with an attention that might seem excessive to anyone observing from the outside, but which was exactly proportional for someone who had spent 2.5 years without seeing their own name recognized in anything. Bilateral relations consultant Vera Almeida. She put the card in the pocket of the blazer she had bought the day before. Simple, well cut. In a navy blue color she had chosen without realizing why that specific color, and walked to the window. São Paulo spread out before her, with its usual noisy immensity. Somewhere in this city, Renato Cavalcanti was trying to rebuild what had collapsed. Somewhere, Donna Graça was receiving the new employee with the kindness she had learned to cultivate. Somewhere, Patricia the waitress was starting her shift with perhaps a little less fear of being invisible than there was before. And there, at that window, Vera Almeida was looking forward. Not with triumph. Triumph was what Renato had expected from her that night, and she had refused that role in the same way she had refused the money, but with something more solid, the clarity of someone who knows where they came from, what it cost to get here, and that the next step belongs to her. The cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Kenji. The first work meeting would be next week with a group of suppliers from the south of the country who wanted to enter the Asian market. He needed someone who knew both sides of the table. Vera typed back, "I will be there." Outside in the city, life continued with its usual noise. But for Vera, that particular moment had the specific silence of beginnings, the type that precedes not the end of a story, but the first chapter of the one worth living. 3 months later, a discreet note in a blog specialized in foreign trade mentioned that Watanabe International had established a partnership with 2 Brazilian suppliers of premium seafood for export to the Japanese market. The note cited as the facilitator of the negotiations a Brazilian consultant with long experience in Japan. The name was there, printed without ambiguity, Vera Almeida. Renato Cavalcanti, who had finally given the interview to the columnist after 3 weeks of trying to avoid it, had been cited in a story about controversial practices in the export sector. Nothing that constituted a formal lawsuit, but enough for 2 investors who had been his partners for years to ask for time for a portfolio reassessment. He had read the note about Vera without commenting to anyone. He had closed his laptop and stayed in silence for a while. There are moments when life presents us with the difference between what we value and what we should value. And those moments usually arrive disguised as situations that seemed at the beginning easy to control. At the restaurant Imperador, Patricia had been promoted to shift leader after Rodrigo wrote a formal recommendation highlighting her ability to stay calm in pressure situations. She had accepted the promotion with a firm voice and a handshake that did not tremble. Donna Graça had framed the note the employees had written to Vera, a copy she had kept for herself, and placed it in her desk drawer. Not on the wall, not on display. In the drawer, where only she knew it was. The type of thing one keeps not to show, but to remember. And Vera, on a Wednesday afternoon, was sitting in a meeting room with a view of Avenida Faria Lima, presenting in Japanese and Portuguese a supplier analysis report that carried on the cover only her name. There was nothing else that needed to be proven. There was only the work, done with competence and with honesty, and the name of the person who did it, visible, permanent, impossible to be erased. Sometimes it only takes a single voice to silence an entire room. And sometimes that same voice, when it finally finds the space it deserves, is capable of building something that lasts much longer than any torn contract. Dear listeners, we hope that Vera Almeida's story has touched your hearts, because it is not just the story of a woman who spoke Japanese in the wrong place at the right time. It is the story of each of us who has already been invisible when we deserved to be seen, who has already kept a talent inside a uniform that the world did not know how to recognize. To continue this journey with us, we have prepared a special selection of stories with the same power to make you feel that dignity always finds its way. Find this playlist here beside you. If this story moved something in you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. What was the moment when you refused to accept less than you deserved? We read everything, answer everything, and we exist because of you. Until the next story, which is already waiting for you.